Let's face it, there's a ton of aftermarket intakes out there, from mild to just plain wild. But how do you know which one is the right one for your engine? Choosing the correct intake manifold can pay huge dividends with increased power and additional torque for your engine, but only if you make an educated decision. Let's take a quick look at a stock intake manifold. The plenum in a stock manifold is typically on the smaller side. This helps keep the air velocity high. Likewise, the cross-section of the runners is also fairly small. This keeps the air moving at maximum speed and the fuel atomized going into the cylinders. These small runners provide good idle quality and crisp throttle response, but the smaller size also limits the amount of air that the manifold can flow, especially at higher RPMs. Eventually, the engine's going to reach a point where it's trying to pull in more air than the stock intake can actually flow. This is the point at which a stock intake manifold needs to be upgraded to a performance manifold with a larger plenum and larger runners. As with most situations, when building an engine, the intake manifold should be matched to your intended purpose for your engine. Be sure to consider the engine combination that you're building or already have. Will your project be a daily driver, or is it going to be a weekend warrior for the strip or the track? These are some important questions to ask yourself, so be realistic with your answers. Throwing a bunch of mismatched parts at your engine more than likely isn't going to give you the performance that you're looking for. Everyone likes the look of a big tunnel ram with dual quads sticking through the hood, but it's probably not the most practical setup for your weekend cruiser. Intake manufacturers advertise RPM ranges, identifying where their intakes are the most efficient. For example, an intake manufacturer may advertise a range of 1500 to 6500 RPMs. Taking into consideration this advertised RPM range is one of the easiest guides to use when choosing the right intake for your engine. Most street cars seem to work best with a dual plane intake, and most advertise an RPM range of idle to 6,000 RPMs, or even 1,500 to 6,500 RPMs, simply because that's the RPM range that they're running at most of the time. Race cars typically produce their power more in the upper RPM ranges and will require a single plane intake with a 2,500 to 8,000 RPM range. You also need to consider the physical fitment. Be sure to select the appropriate part number for your engine and cylinder head design. And look for any specific features that you may need, like engine vacuum ports, water coolant ports, carburetor flange fitment, and don't forget to check for proper hood clearance before you close the hood. Let's take a look at the dual plane intake. They're named for the split plenum opening just below where the carburetor sits, and each side of this opening feeds 4 of the cylinders on a V8. Dual plane intakes are popular on performance street and some mild racing applications, since they generally build power across a wider RPM range, starting at idle to 1,500 RPMs, depending on the manifold. Every intake has its own performance characteristics, so it's best to know how you plan to use your vehicle and select an intake from there. Holley and Wian carry a variety of dual plane intakes in several configurations, including 2x4 and 3x2 setups. They're an excellent choice for performance intake in this RPM range. In a single plane intake, all the cylinders share the same intake plenum. Fuel and air from the carburetor enters the intake through this one opening without any separation, unlike the dual plane. This single hole feeds all 8 cylinders on a V8. Single plane intakes are typically less restrictive and work best for building power between 3,000 and 8,000 RPMs. Because of the higher RPM range, a single plane intake manifold is best suited for racing applications and not so much for your daily driver. Holley's Strip Dominator and Wian's Accelerator, Track Warrior, and Team G intakes are excellent intakes designed to perform in this power band range. If you are looking for something a little more outside the box, then check out Wian's line of high ram intakes. They're a nostalgic looking single plane intake that you can run either a single or 4-barrel setup with. And a more modern look can be had with one of our Sniper sheet metal fabricated intakes. They too are available in single or dual 4-barrel configurations. You may also hear the term low-rise and high-rise manifold. Both of these terms refer to the overall height of the intake manifold, but they can also help identify the RPM range that they work best in. There is no standard or set height where the low-rise intakes end and high-rise intakes begin, but low-rise manifolds are usually similar in height to a stock intake dimension. They offer good hood clearance, and most applications allow you to build your combination without having to cut a hole in your hood or add in a hood scoop. Low-rise can also identify the runner length and RPM range as well. The shorter, closer to stock length runners will perform closer to the factory specs, and also offer great throttle response right off idle and throughout the RPM range. High-rise intakes, on the other hand, are better for building horsepower in the upper RPM range and typically have larger and longer intake runners. The power band of a high-rise usually starts around 2,700 to 3,000 RPMs, and they can be capable of making power all the way through 7 to even 8,000 RPMs. The last bit of information that you're going to need to consider when selecting your intake manifold depends directly on which carburetor or throttle body that you plan to use. For street, you'll likely find two choices of mounting flanges. First is the 4150, or commonly referred to as the square bore style. This design uses 4 holes of equal size, or you may see that it has one large square hole or even 2 elongated holes for the intake opening. They're designed to work with a wide variety of Holley, Quick Fuel, Brawler, and Demon carburetors with the 4150 flange. The second design is called a spread bore. It can have 4 holes, or you may find a spread bore manifold with a large single hole or even 2 elongated holes. But if you look closer, you'll see that the opening is larger towards the rear portion. If we take a look at this Holley spread bore carburetor, you'll notice that the front holes of the primary venturis are smaller in diameter when compared to the rear or secondary holes. The odd shape of these intakes allow clearance for the larger secondary venturis found on the spread bore carburetors. If you happen to find a manifold you like, but it's not available for your particular carburetor, there are plenty of adapters available to mount a square bore carb to a spread bore intake and vice versa. The third choice you'll run into is the 4500 or Dominator style intake. These are typically single plane intakes, and they're designed for racing or high horsepower applications. They have the much larger 4500 style mounting flange, which allows you to mount one of our Dominator carburetors to. So now that we've covered the basics, you can see just how important intake manifold selection is. Remember, match the RPM range of the manifold with the RPM range of your other engine components, and you'll be happier in the long run, and so will your engine. Thanks for watching, and to see our full line of intake manifolds and intake accessories, visit our website at holley.com.